What happens when a billionaire heir brings a powerful woman to his sister's wedding, and the groom calls her boss? Tonight's story is about more than love. It's about power, respect, and the chaos that erupts when a woman who's built her own empire steps into a world of old money and hidden secrets. Jasmine is no ordinary woman. She's a force. She's the reason a business survives, the reason a man finds his strength, and the reason an entire family's carefully crafted image starts to crack. But will her presence in a room full of judgmental eyes tear everything apart, or will it change them forever? Where are you listening from? And if you enjoyed this story, please like the video and let me know in the comments section below. I'd love to hear your thoughts and keep the conversation going. The grand ballroom sparkled with chandeliers hanging like glistening diamonds, casting soft light over the guests. The air was filled with the sound of clinking glasses, polite chatter, and the faint hum of classical music. Every inch of the room screamed wealth: gilded frames on the walls, crystal glasses filled with the finest champagne, and an endless array of delicate hors d'oeuvres being passed around on silver trays. This was no ordinary wedding. This was Olivia Grant's wedding, and to say it was exclusive would be an understatement. At the entrance of the ballroom, Alexander Grant stood tall, a man who'd mastered the art of composure. His chiseled jawline and impeccable suit made him look like a figure from a high-end magazine cover. His eyes, however, betrayed a flicker of uncertainty as he glanced toward the entrance. Behind him, standing confidently in a sleek, emerald green dress, was Jasmine Williams, his date for the evening. Jasmine was not like the women Alexander's family was accustomed to seeing in their circles. Where they were often porcelain doll perfect, Jasmine had a quiet strength about her. Her deep, dark skin glowed under the dim lighting, and her natural curls framed her face in an effortless yet captivating way. There was an energy about her, something magnetic and unapologetic, that immediately drew the attention of those around her. She wasn't nervous, though the eyes of every guest in the room were trained on her. She walked with the grace of someone who had long been used to navigating spaces where she wasn't necessarily welcomed. Alexander could feel the slight tension in the air, even though his arm was around her. "Ready?" he asked in a low voice, his eyes scanning the crowd. Jasmine smiled. "I've been ready for this day my whole life." There was a confidence in her voice that made Alexander feel small in comparison. He had been privileged, born into the top tier of society, but Jasmine had earned every inch of her place. As they entered the ballroom, heads turned. Conversation stuttered and people exchanged glances, trying to place the unfamiliar face by Alexander's side. At the front of the room, Olivia, Alexander's younger sister, was just finishing her vows with her groom, Ethan Hayes. The moment Jasmine stepped into the room, Ethan's eyes locked on hers and something shifted. There was a moment of recognition, something familiar in her calm, commanding presence. As he shook her hand, he blurted out, "Boss." The word hung in the air, a strange, awkward weight that made the room go silent for a split second. Alexander's jaw tightened. He had expected this day to be full of tension, his family's conservative views, their ingrained social hierarchy. But this was unexpected. Jasmine raised an eyebrow but kept her smile intact. "Nice to meet you, Ethan," she said, her voice smooth and warm, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of discomfort. Alexander could tell she had experienced moments like these before, and he hated that for her. Ethan, oblivious to the ripples his words caused, chuckled nervously and let go of Jasmine's hand, his face flushed with embarrassment. He quickly turned to Olivia, trying to brush off the awkward moment. "I guess I'm just used to, the way Jasmine runs things at work." The guests exchanged confused looks. No one quite understood the relationship between Ethan and Jasmine, but something about the way Ethan said "boss" raised a lot of questions. Alexander could feel the undercurrent of judgment ripple through the room, and it made his blood boil. His family wasn't cruel, but they were traditional, obsessed with appearances. They didn't expect someone like Jasmine, a successful black woman, to fit into their world. To them, she was an outsider, and tonight, they were going to make sure she felt it. As Olivia stood beside her new husband, she watched the exchange between Jasmine and Ethan with a mix of confusion and discomfort. The tension between the two women was palpable. She had always been the golden child of the family, the one who had never challenged the status quo. But Jasmine, she was different. Her presence in this world felt like a challenge, one Olivia wasn't sure she was ready to confront. But there was something about Jasmine's quiet strength, her refusal to shrink into the background, that unsettled Olivia. And it wasn't just Olivia, several of the other guests were noticing it too. Jasmine wasn't a woman who could be ignored, and for the first time in the room, there was an unspoken shift in power. Jasmine wasn't just Alexander's date, she was something far more significant. Are you enjoying this story so far? Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on what's coming next. It's about to get even more intense. What do you think of Jasmine's entrance? How would you have reacted if you were in Alexander's position? Don't forget to hit like if you're excited to see how this drama unfolds. The dinner was set, and the guests settled into their seats, sipping champagne and nibbling on delicate appetizers. The grand chandelier above seemed to mock the gathering, its dazzling light casting elongated shadows over the tables as the soft murmur of polite conversation filled the room. But beneath the surface, there was a palpable tension, one that neither the champagne nor the fine china could conceal. Alexander sat beside Jasmine, trying to seem calm, but his hand instinctively reached for hers under the table. She didn't pull away. Her presence, though calm, radiated strength, and Alexander couldn't help but admire her in this sea of superficiality. The Grant family was a world unto itself, cloistered, self-assured, and obsessed with status. But Jasmine didn't need to fit into their mold. She was someone who had built her empire through hard work, intellect, and fierce determination, and she had no intention of hiding any of that. Across from them, Ethan was trying to navigate the dinner conversation. His demeanor, usually confident, now faltered as he glanced nervously between Jasmine and Olivia, who seemed to be exchanging words with Alexander. The air felt thick, as though everyone in the room had suddenly become hyper-aware of Jasmine's presence. Olivia's smile was tight, her gaze flicking over to Jasmine now and then, clearly uncomfortable with the attention she was receiving. At the other end of the long banquet table, a few of the other guests whispered among themselves. They were curious about Jasmine. How had she risen to such a level of power in such a short time? And why was she with Alexander, the heir to the Grant Empire? "Tell me more about your business, Jasmine." Uncle Henry's voice rang out across the table, breaking the silence. He was an older man, graying at the temples, with a reputation for being blunt. His probing question hung in the air, as though he were testing her. Jasmine didn't flinch. She met his gaze directly, her calm demeanor undisturbed. "I run a tech consulting firm. We specialize in cybersecurity and data privacy solutions for businesses. It's a field that's growing, and I've been fortunate enough to lead a team that's on the cutting edge." Her voice was confident, measured. It wasn't arrogance, it was simple truth. The table grew quiet. Some of the guests exchanged glances, impressed but unsure of how to respond. Alexander could sense the shift in the room. To them, Jasmine was an anomaly, an outsider who didn't fit the mold of their wealthy, insular world. But she didn't need their approval. She had earned her place through her own grit. "Impressive," Uncle Henry said, though his tone still carried a hint of skepticism. "And what exactly is your role in this company? Are you just the face of it, or do you run the operations?" The question was pointed, and Alexander could see Jasmine's jaw tighten. She didn't take offense, but she was ready for the challenge. "I don't just sit behind a desk and smile for the cameras. I make the hard calls. I'm hands-on. I lead my team and make sure we stay ahead of the curve." Her words were calm but delivered with the same quiet strength that Alexander had come to admire. At the other end of the table, Olivia cleared her throat. Her voice, when she spoke, was softer but filled with a subtle edge. Well, it's not every day you meet someone who's not just a pretty face, right, Alexander? Her smile was thin, her eyes darting toward Jasmine before quickly shifting away. The comment stung, but Jasmine's composure remained unshaken. She simply smiled and took a sip of her wine, aware of the subtle dig that had been thrown her way. She had long been accustomed to this type of behavior. People often underestimated her based on her appearance, assuming she was simply another socialite or, in the case of this gathering, just someone Alexander was dating for the evening. But tonight, she wasn't just a date. Alexander, sensing the shift in the conversation, leaned in slightly, his voice low but firm. Actually, Olivia, Jasmine's a lot more than that. She's built a multi-million-dollar company from the ground up. She's not just a face. She's the one making the calls, running the operations. You should be proud to have her here. His words were a subtle defense, but Olivia's brow furrowed, and she looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the growing tension. Across the room, a few of the other guests were now whispering more audibly. They had picked up on the undercurrent of discord, and it was making some of them uncomfortable. A few of the women exchanged knowing glances, their eyes lingering on Jasmine's bold and commanding presence, unsure of how to respond to someone who refused to conform to their expectations. Ethan, sensing the awkwardness, tried to lighten the mood. "So, Jasmine, tell us more about what you do for fun. I mean, we can't all just be business all the time, right?" Jasmine smiled. "I enjoy hiking and traveling. I've been to a lot of places. There's something about exploring new landscapes that helps me disconnect and refocus. Nature's a good reset." Her words were casual, but her presence at the table was anything but. She wasn't just the woman with Alexander. She wasn't just the woman who helped Ethan's company survive a financial crisis. She wasn't the woman who had brought with her the quiet strength of someone who had built an empire from the ground up. She was Jasmine, and she was going to take up space, whether they liked it or not. As the dinner progressed, the guests, now more intrigued by Jasmine, continued to steal glances her way. The polite chatter that once filled the air had quieted, and now the room felt more like a stage where the actors were pretending not to notice the weight of their roles. Jasmine's presence had become the center of attention, unspoken, yet undeniable. Alexander watched it all. He could sense the disapproval in the room, but it wasn't from Jasmine. No, she remained unbothered, a silent force navigating this sea of unfamiliar faces. It was the others, the ones who were used to seeing the world through a narrow lens, that were struggling to reconcile the image of her in their minds. She didn't belong here, they thought. She wasn't like the others. The next conversation between Ethan and Jasmine was punctuated by an awkward pause. Ethan was trying hard to make small talk, desperate to bridge the gap between his previous awkward moment and the reality of the dinner. "So, Jasmine, what inspired you to get into cybersecurity?" Ethan asked, attempting to sound casual. But the question felt forced, out of place. He had never asked someone that question before. It wasn't the kind of thing he would have asked the women he dated or the people he usually associated with. Jasmine, never one to miss an opportunity to educate, leaned forward slightly. "The world has changed, Ethan. Everything is connected, and the need for protection has grown exponentially. I started with a small team, then built it up over the years. I didn't always know what I was doing, but I figured it out. It's a field that doesn't give you second chances, so you either get it right or you get left behind." Her words, sharp and direct, landed in the space between them like a challenge. Ethan blinked, taken aback by the quiet force behind them. She wasn't just answering his question. She was speaking truths that demanded respect, truths he hadn't been prepared to hear from someone who, in his eyes, was still just Alexander's date. Before Ethan could respond, the conversation was interrupted by Olivia, who had been watching the exchange with a growing sense of discomfort. She leaned over, her voice a little too bright. "Well, this is all very impressive, but tell me, Jasmine," Olivia began, her words laced with an edge. "What does someone like you do for fun? I'm guessing you don't spend much time at parties or attending family weddings, right?" Jasmine smiled, though the question stung. "Actually, I do. I believe in balance. Business is important, but life is short, Olivia. I make time for both." The words hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Olivia, like many of the people in this room, had underestimated her. Jasmine wasn't just a successful businesswoman. She was also capable of taking part in the world of wealth and luxury, without losing her core values. Olivia blinked, caught off guard by the calmness in Jasmine's tone. She had expected a different reaction, one more in line with the quiet submissiveness the world often expected from someone like Jasmine. At the far end of the table, Uncle Henry continued to watch the exchange, his face a mixture of confusion and intrigue. He had been skeptical at first, questioning Jasmine's place in their world. But now, he wasn't so sure. There was something about the way she carried herself that made him uncomfortable, but also curious. As the meal went on, Ethan found himself drawn into more conversations with Jasmine, though he never truly understood the weight of her presence. His admiration for her intellect, though evident, seemed to be clouded by his own insecurities. However, Alexander, ever observant, ever protective, was watching the interactions with increasing unease. The dynamic between Ethan and Jasmine had shifted. It wasn't just business anymore. There was something deeper at play, something that had nothing to do with deals or contracts, but with power. The conversation turned toward the future of Ethan's business and Jasmine's role in it. "You know, Jasmine, if it weren't for you, I wouldn't be sitting here tonight," Ethan said, his voice quieter now. "I don't know what I would have done without your help." It was the most vulnerable moment Ethan had allowed himself all night. For the first time, he was acknowledging that Jasmine had been the catalyst for his success. She had been the one who had kept him from sinking when his company was in trouble, the one who had fought for deals, managed investors, and ensured the survival of a company on the verge of collapse. Jasmine's eyes softened, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. Ethan had finally acknowledged the truth, but his family still hadn't caught up. Across the table, Olivia watched the exchange with a growing sense of discomfort. She couldn't deny it now. Jasmine was more than just Alexander's guest. She had shaped the very business that had brought them all here. The truth gnawed at her. How did you? How did you even get involved with this business in the first place?" Olivia asked, her voice barely masking the judgment that still lingered in her words. Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. "I wasn't born into it, Olivia, but I had a vision, and I worked hard to make that vision a reality. It wasn't easy, but nothing worth having ever is." The word struck a nerve. Olivia, who had never really had to fight for anything, felt the sting of Jasmine's success, a success that had been earned in a world where the odds were always stacked against people like her. The dinner continued, but the dynamic had shifted. Jasmine wasn't just a passive observer in this world of wealth and privilege. She was now the catalyst that was shaking things up, making the others confront their assumptions about success, identity, and the expectations they placed on people like her. As the meal came to a close, the tension in the room was thick. Conversations were now fractured. People tried to smile and laugh, but the cracks had begun to show. Jasmine had become the unspoken center of the room, and with it, the cracks in the family's carefully constructed facade were starting to show. As the dinner plates were cleared away and guests moved toward the lounge area, the quiet hum of conversation resumed, but it was no longer the same. The once seamless flow of polite exchanges had fractured. People lingered on the edges of conversations, casting sidelong glances at Jasmine, their minds racing with questions they hadn't dared ask. The night's earlier tensions had left an undeniable mark on the atmosphere. Olivia, especially, seemed preoccupied, her movements sharp, her eyes distant. Alexander had noticed. He had always been attuned to his sister's moods, and he could see the discomfort bubbling beneath the surface. Olivia wasn't one to easily show vulnerability, but tonight she was struggling to maintain her usual grace. As the evening wore on, Ethan seemed to withdraw into himself, lost in thought. It wasn't the attention Jasmine had garnered that bothered him. It was the stark realization that he was now a small part of a much bigger story. Jasmine wasn't just another business consultant or a woman in Alexander's life. She was someone who had saved him from ruin, someone who held the power to change everything. And yet, despite her importance, she was still viewed with suspicion by those around her. In the far corner of the room, Olivia made her way toward a quiet area, away from the party, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Alexander, sensing the growing divide between them, followed, feeling an uneasy twist in his stomach. His sister had always been the center of attention at their family gatherings, but now her face was twisted in a rare expression of frustration. "Olivia," he said softly, approaching her with care, "are you okay?" Olivia didn't turn around immediately. Her fingers traced the rim of her wine glass, her thoughts far away. When she did look at him, there was a quiet sharpness in her gaze. "You really brought her here, didn't you?" she asked, her voice low, yet filled with more emotion than Alexander had expected. "Who, Jasmine?" Alexander replied, his brow furrowing. "She's not just a her, Olivia. She's an important part of my life now, and you're going to have to get used to that." Olivia let out a sharp breath, clearly not ready for this conversation. "I don't know, Alexander, it's just so different. She's not like us. She doesn't fit here. And it's not just that, it's the way Ethan keeps looking at her." Her voice quivered slightly, the cracks in her composure starting to show. "He calls her boss like she's some kind of a leader." Alexander finished her sentence, his voice soft but firm. "Because that's what she is, Olivia. She's a leader, and you need to accept that." Olivia's jaw clenched, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "It's not about leadership, Alexander. It's about the way people like her don't belong in our world. She's not one of us. And we're supposed to just accept that." Her eyes glinted with frustration, and for the first time, Alexander saw the vulnerability in her eyes. "I think you're scared," he said quietly. "You're scared because Jasmine doesn't need to fit into your world to make a difference. She's built her own world, Olivia, one that's far beyond anything we could have imagined." Olivia didn't respond right away. She stared at her glass for a long moment, and for the first time, the fierce, self-assured woman who had been the center of their family's world seemed small. "I didn't think I was scared," Olivia finally said, her voice quieter now. "I just thought, maybe some things are better left the way they are." Alexander took a step closer to her, lowering his voice. "Change doesn't happen that way. If you're still holding on to these old ideas about how things are supposed to be, then you're the one who's going to get left behind." A long silence passed between them, and just as Olivia opened her mouth to speak, the tension in the air shifted. Jasmine appeared at the entrance to the quiet room, her presence unmistakable. She had been watching from the doorway, sensing the conversation between the siblings. Her eyes met Alexander's first, then slid to Olivia. There was no malice in her gaze, only understanding. She knew what had been said, even without hearing it. "Mind if I join you too?" Jasmine asked, her voice even and calm. Olivia hesitated but then nodded, not saying a word. She had no response, no defense for the truth of Jasmine's words. Jasmine walked over and stood beside Olivia, her presence both quiet and commanding. "I think we need to clear the air," she began, her eyes locking with Olivia. "I don't expect you to understand me or to immediately accept who I am. But what I do expect, Olivia, is respect. Not because I want your approval, but because respect is something I've earned." Her words were direct, yet there was no anger in her voice, just the calm, unyielding certainty of someone who had faced far harsher challenges than this. Olivia blinked, taken aback by Jasmine's directness. She was used to people tiptoeing around her feelings, especially in this world of privilege where appearances mattered more than truth. But Jasmine wasn't like anyone Olivia had ever encountered. She wasn't afraid to confront uncomfortable truths. I've had to work twice as hard, Olivia, to get even half of what your family takes for granted. And I don't do it for you or for anyone else but for me, because I believe in what I do and I'm damn good at it. Jasmine's voice softened slightly. I don't need to be part of your world to succeed, and I certainly don't need your approval to be happy. For a moment, Olivia said nothing. Then, as if the weight of Jasmine's words had finally begun to sink in, she spoke quietly. I didn't mean it like that. It's just, all of this is new to me. Jasmine nodded, the corners of her mouth lifting in a small, understanding smile. It's new to me too, Olivia, but the world doesn't change if we keep pretending things are the way they used to be. She paused before adding, and the way forward isn't about fitting in. It's about standing your ground. If you can't do that, you'll lose yourself along the way. The silence between them was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. Olivia, still processing Jasmine's words, glanced at Alexander, who stood off to the side, his arms crossed. He gave her a single, knowing nod. This was the conversation she needed to have. This was the moment when Jasmine would finally show her that her world wasn't as invincible as she thought. I think I have a lot to think about, Olivia murmured, and for the first time there was a slight softness in her voice. Jasmine smiled, the tension dissipating. Take your time, I'm not going anywhere. The evening wore on, and the energy in the ballroom seemed to shift again, though in a more subtle way. Conversations flowed more freely now, though the air still crackled with an undercurrent of tension. People didn't know how to react to the growing presence of Jasmine in their midst. Some were curious, others uncertain, but all were unsettled. Jasmine had done what no one in the room expected. She had taken up space. She had shifted the dynamic of the evening with nothing more than her calm resolve, and it had left its mark. As the evening stretched on, the wedding ceremony had reached its quieter stages. Some guests had moved toward the lounge area, others gathered near the dance floor, but Olivia remained at the back of the room, leaning against a pillar. Her thoughts were swirling. Jasmine's words had cut through her defenses in a way she hadn't anticipated. For so long, Olivia had clung to the idea that things could remain the same, that the world she knew, her world, was the right way. But now, with Jasmine's presence challenging everything she had once believed, Olivia didn't know where she stood anymore. Alexander watched her from across the room. He had been more than aware of the shift in her behavior. She was still processing. And as much as he wanted to confront her, to demand that she see what was right in front of her, he knew it had to come from her. Jasmine had said what needed to be said. Now it was up to Olivia to figure out how to move forward. Across the room, Ethan was deep in conversation with some of his business partners, but his eyes kept flicking over to Jasmine, who had moved to the edge of the dance floor, where a few guests were mingling. The earlier awkwardness had faded into something more contemplative, more admiring. Despite himself, Ethan found himself increasingly intrigued by Jasmine. Her ability to command a room, to be both gracious and formidable in the face of judgment, was something he admired. But that admiration was tinged with something else, a twinge of guilt. He couldn't help but feel that he owed her more than just his business success. Jasmine had been the one to guide him through the rough patches, to lend him her expertise when his company was on the brink of collapse. And now, here she was, still standing beside him, her strength unwavering, despite the judgment she was receiving. And yet, he had never truly acknowledged the depth of her contributions. The word boss had been a simple slip of the tongue, but it had meant more than he'd intended. And now, he couldn't shake the feeling that it had drawn more attention to the truth he'd been ignoring. As he walked toward her, his footsteps slowed. She wasn't standing alone, but rather engaged in a quiet conversation with a few of the other women in the room. They weren't the usual socialites. They were businesswomen, influencers, and innovators, people who didn't follow the same tired social script. There was a sharpness to their conversation that fascinated Ethan. He had never seen Jasmine in this light before, surrounded by women who spoke the same language, who didn't need to explain themselves or their achievements. There was no posturing here, no pretenses. They were all on equal footing. He hesitated at the edge of the group, watching her with a growing sense of realization. He wasn't just in awe of her strength. He was beginning to see her as someone who wasn't just his savior in business, but someone whose influence had the potential to reshape everything. She was changing his world, and more importantly, she was changing the way he saw himself. Jasmine, Ethan said, his voice softer than usual. The group paused, turning their attention to him. Jasmine smiled and excused herself from the conversation, her gaze warm but curious. "Ethan," she replied, her tone as composed as ever, "I thought you were with your partners." "I was," he said, taking a step closer, "but I couldn't help but notice how you've handled everything tonight." Jasmine tilted her head slightly, her expression softening. "Handled what exactly?" "The way people look at you, the way you carry yourself in a room full of people who have no idea what it means to work for anything." His voice held a quiet honesty now, the guarded exterior slipping away. "You don't just fit in here, Jasmine. You stand out. And it's not because you're Alexander's date. It's because of everything you've built, everything you are. And I think that scares them." Jasmine's eyes met his, and for a moment there was a quiet understanding between them. She could see the shift in Ethan, his growing realization that he hadn't truly understood her until now. "I don't need their approval, Ethan," she said, her voice steady but tinged with something deeper. "I never did." Ethan nodded, the weight of her words settling in. "I think I've been blind to a lot of things. I never fully realized how much you've done for me, how much you've done for all of us. I've always thought of you as the help, but you're not. You're the reason I'm standing here." Her gaze softened, but there was no pity in it, just recognition. "You're a good man, Ethan, but I've always known that. What you needed was someone who believed in you enough to make sure you didn't sink. That's all." Ethan swallowed hard, feeling a rush of gratitude flood him. But just as quickly, the moment was interrupted by a loud voice from across the room. "Ethan, over here." It was Olivia. She had watched the interaction from the other side of the room, her gaze fixed on Ethan and Jasmine, though she couldn't hear their words. The tension that had simmered throughout the night had reached its breaking point. Olivia had been trying to ignore it, but it was impossible now. She could feel herself being pulled toward them, the need to confront the truth too powerful to resist any longer. Ethan exchanged a look with Jasmine, and the unspoken question hung in the air. Would they face this together? Jasmine nodded, ever the composed figure. "Let's see what she has to say," she said, her voice calm, though there was a steeliness to it that Alexander's sister would soon come to understand. The soft clink of glass and the gentle murmur of voices filled the room as guests moved about, trying to relax after the dinner. But the undercurrent of tension was undeniable. The Grant family had always prided themselves on their perfect image, their untouchable status. But tonight, Jasmine had shattered that image, and Olivia was feeling it more deeply than she had ever anticipated. As Ethan and Jasmine made their way across the room toward Olivia, the atmosphere shifted once again. The quiet murmur of guests faded into a low hum as their eyes followed the trio. Even the most casual observer could sense the discomfort, the way the conversation had turned from lighthearted to something much more charged. Olivia stood near the far end of the room, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. Her gaze was fixed firmly on the ground, her thoughts whirling. She had never felt more out of place in her life. This wasn't just about Jasmine anymore. It was about everything Olivia had come to rely on. The Grant legacy was built on unquestioned tradition, on control, and on fitting in. But Jasmine had exposed the fragility of that legacy. She wasn't just Alexander's date, she was a force, and Olivia had felt that force push against everything she knew. As Ethan and Jasmine approached, Olivia's expression shifted. It was no longer the cool, composed face she had worn throughout the evening. Now her jaw was clenched, her eyes sharp with something more, resentment. "You two make quite the pair," Olivia said, her voice light but cutting. She looked at Ethan for a moment, then turned her gaze to Jasmine, her words now pointed. I'm sure you're very proud of your business ventures, Jasmine, but there's something you need to understand. This family doesn't just operate on achievements and business success. There's tradition. There's status. Jasmine stood her ground, her expression calm and unyielding. I'm not interested in your family's traditions, Olivia, she said softly, but there was a firm edge to her voice. I'm not here to be part of a legacy that's built on exclusion. I'm here because I'm important to Alexander, and whether you like it or not, that's something your family will need to get used to. Olivia's nostrils flared as she stepped forward. You think you can just walk into this world and demand respect, she sneered. You think because you've built a business from scratch that you can dictate how we live, how we think. Alexander, who had been quietly observing the exchange from behind, finally stepped in, his voice low but full of authority. That's enough, Olivia. Olivia whipped her head toward him, her eyes wide with disbelief. Enough. I'm the one who's had to put up with this all night, Alexander. You bring her here, your business partner or whatever she is, and suddenly she's the center of attention. She's disrupting everything. She's. Enough, Alexander repeated, his tone sharp. This isn't about you. This isn't about the way things have always been. This is about people being real with each other for the first time. People like Jasmine don't need to fit into your world. They create their own. Jasmine watched as the siblings faced off, the tension between them palpable. She had never been one to shrink from conflict, and now she could feel the weight of Olivia's judgment closing in. But she refused to let it rattle her. Olivia's jaw tightened, but she couldn't hold the anger in any longer. You think she's better than me, don't you? She snapped, her eyes flicking toward Jasmine. That's what this is about, right? You think she's superior because she built something, because she made her own way. Do you even realize what that means? Jasmine took a slow, deliberate step forward, her gaze never leaving Olivia's. She was done with the small talk, done with the passive-aggressive jabs. She had come this far. She wasn't about to back down now. What it means, Olivia, is that I didn't have a silver spoon in my mouth. I didn't have a legacy handed down to me. I had to fight for everything I've achieved. But that doesn't make me better than you. It just makes me someone who's willing to work for what they want, no matter the odds. What it means is I'm not here to compete with you. I'm here because I deserve to be. For a moment the room was silent. Olivia looked taken aback, the fury in her eyes wavering, replaced with something else, something closer to fear. She had never had to confront someone like Jasmine before. She had always been the one in control, the one who could navigate any situation with ease. But Jasmine wasn't playing by the same rules. Ethan, who had remained quiet until now, spoke up, his voice low but steady. Olivia, she's right. I wouldn't be standing here if it weren't for Jasmine. I wouldn't have a company, I wouldn't have my reputation. She's not some outsider, she's the reason I've made it this far. The words hit Olivia like a physical blow. She had always seen Ethan as someone who was in control, someone who had built his success with his own hands. But now, here he was, admitting that the very person she had been dismissing all evening had been the one to save him. She felt small, and she hated it. For the first time, Olivia saw the gulf between herself and Jasmine, not in the physical space between them, but in the kind of lives they had led. Jasmine had built something from nothing. Olivia had inherited everything she knew, everything she had, and in that moment it all seemed so hollow. I don't know how to fix this, Olivia muttered, her voice barely audible. I don't know how to deal with all of this. Jasmine's expression softened, though there was no hint of pity in her eyes. You don't have to fix anything, Olivia, she said gently. You just have to accept it. The words hung in the air, an unspoken challenge that Olivia wasn't ready to accept. Not yet. As the conversation shifted away from the confrontation, Jasmine could feel a weight lifting from her shoulders. She had said what needed to be said. There was no turning back. In the distance, Alexander watched the exchange, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. This wasn't just about him and Jasmine anymore. This was about breaking down the walls that had kept their world confined for so long, and while it was painful, he knew it was the only way forward. Jasmine had come into his life as someone who challenged everything he knew. But now, he realized, she was someone who was reshaping not only his future, but the future of everyone in this room. The rest of the evening passed in an uncomfortable silence, the kind that lingered long after a confrontation had settled. The festive air of the wedding had dissipated, replaced with an awkward tension that no amount of laughter or polite conversation could erase. Jasmine stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the darkened city skyline, watching the lights blink in rhythm with the uneasy pulse of her thoughts. The wedding was no longer a celebration. It had become a battleground, a place where old truths were being exposed, and the ground beneath everyone's feet felt like it was shifting. Olivia had retreated to the far corner of the room, surrounded by a few of the women from the wedding party. She looked like she was trying to regain her composure, but her eyes betrayed her. Jasmine could see the internal struggle. Olivia wasn't used to being in the position of weakness, and she resented it. The power dynamic had shifted, and it was clear that she was grappling with the realization that Jasmine wasn't just another woman in Alexander's life. She was a woman who had carved her own path, and now her presence was forcing everyone in the room to reckon with that. From across the room, Ethan caught Jasmine's eye. His expression was unreadable, but there was something else in it, a flicker of understanding, perhaps a silent acknowledgement of the battle she was facing. He had been on the receiving end of her brilliance, and even though his own insecurities still clung to him, there was respect now where once there had only been the discomfort of feeling inferior. As Jasmine turned back to face the room, she felt the weight of the moment settle deeper. She wasn't here to fight anyone's battles. She wasn't here to prove anything. But this was different. This wasn't just about her and Alexander. This was about changing the narrative that had been written for people like her long before she had ever stepped into this world. Alexander approached her quietly, as if sensing her thoughts. He had been watching the events unfold from the periphery, taking it all in. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder, a quiet show of support, but his words were far more loaded than the gesture. "I never wanted it to be like this," he said softly, his voice low enough that only Jasmine could hear. Jasmine smiled faintly, turning to face him fully. "You never wanted any of this, but I've known from the start that my presence here would be disruptive. You know that, right?" "I thought I could shield you from all of it," Alexander continued, his eyes searching hers for something, understanding, maybe, or perhaps reassurance. "But it's like you've been in a different world, Jasmine. A world I didn't really understand. I thought I could make things easier for you." Jasmine took a deep breath, her expression softening but her resolve as strong as ever. "You don't need to shield me, Alexander. I'm not fragile. I didn't come into your world looking for protection or validation. I came here because I have as much right to be here as anyone else. I've built something that's mine, and I'm not going to hide from that." Her words carried more weight than she realized. Alexander had always been protective of her, but in doing so, he had inadvertently shielded her from fully confronting the realities of their world. He had thought he could protect her from the judgments, the questions, and the cold stares of people who felt threatened by her very presence. But in trying to protect her, he had made her seem like she didn't belong. Jasmine wasn't someone who needed protection. She needed respect. And it was time for them both to face that truth. The sound of heels clicking sharply on the floor drew both of their attention. Olivia approached them, her steps confident but her expression a mix of frustration and something else, something approaching a reluctant understanding. She had heard the tail end of their conversation, and though her pride kept her from backing down, there was no denying the shift that had taken place. "I owe you an apology," Olivia said, her voice tight, but the words were genuine. "I've been difficult tonight. I don't know what it is about you, Jasmine, but you make me question everything I thought I knew about myself." Jasmine didn't flinch. She met Olivia's gaze with the same calm, unwavering certainty she had shown all evening. "That's the thing, Olivia. It's not about me, it's about you. You've spent so much of your life playing the part of the perfect daughter, the perfect sister, the perfect wife, but none of that is real. It's a facade. You need to decide what's real for you, not what you think people expect from you." Olivia stood still, the words sinking in deeper than she cared to admit. Jasmine had a way of cutting through the armor people built around themselves, and though it was uncomfortable, Olivia knew it was the truth. "I don't know who I am without the expectations of this family," Olivia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been so focused on being what everyone wanted me to be that I never really thought about what I wanted. And now—" Her voice trailed off, and for the first time, Olivia seemed vulnerable. The strong, calculated woman who had always commanded the room was suddenly exposed, unsure of her place in this new reality. Jasmine didn't feel sorry for her, but she did feel a flicker of empathy. "You have to make a choice," Jasmine said, her voice steady. "You can stay stuck in this world of what-ifs and shoulds, or you can step into the reality of who you are, without anyone's approval. Trust me, Olivia, it's the hardest thing you'll ever do, but it's also the most freeing." Olivia swallowed hard, her eyes searching Jasmine's face as if trying to find the strength to make that leap. There was silence between them for a long moment, the weight of the conversation pressing in on both women. "I'll think about it," Olivia said finally, her voice quiet but resolute. Jasmine nodded, not needing to say more. Olivia would have to come to terms with her own truth in her own time, but Jasmine had done what she came here to do. She had challenged the very foundation of their family's expectations, and in doing so she had made a way for herself and for those around her to live more honestly. The night wound down, and the tension that had once permeated the room had softened, though the change in the Grant family was irreversible. The unspoken challenge had been issued, and it was clear that things would never be the same again. Jasmine had broken through the walls they had spent so long building, and in doing so, she had shown them all that they didn't have to remain trapped in the world they had known. As Alexander and Jasmine made their way toward the exit, their hands brushed together, and she could feel the unspoken promise between them. She wasn't just stepping into his world, she was reshaping it. And for the first time that night, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. The night had finally reached its quiet end. The lavish ballroom, once buzzing with the frenetic energy of a grand celebration, was now subdued, its sparkling chandeliers flickering in the distance. The guests, those who hadn't already departed, lingered in clusters, their conversations quieter, more reflective, as if the weight of the evening had settled over them like a heavy blanket. Outside, the city lights painted the streets in a dull glow, and the cool air swept through the open doors of the venue. Jasmine stood on the terrace with Alexander, looking out over the skyline, the hum of distant traffic adding a strange sense of finality to the moment. It had been a long night, one that had stretched her patience, her strength, and her resilience in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. But now, with the tension finally beginning to ebb, she felt something else rise in her chest: relief. "We made it through," Alexander said quietly, standing beside her. His voice was thick with emotion, part exhaustion, part pride. Jasmine glanced over at him, her eyes softening. "We did," she agreed. There was a flicker of something unspoken between them, a bond that had strengthened over the course of the evening. What had started as a simple invitation to a family wedding had turned into something much more significant. It had been a test of both their relationship and their individual strengths, and in that testing, they had both emerged stronger. "Olivia, not going to change overnight," Alexander added, his gaze drifting to the distant city lights. "But at least she's starting to see things differently." Jasmine gave a small, rueful smile. "Maybe, but this isn't about changing her, Alexander. It's about showing her there's another way to live. It's up to her whether she takes that step." Alexander nodded slowly, his hand instinctively reaching for hers. The moment felt incredibly intimate, yet profoundly public, as if the entire world was watching them, waiting to see if their bond would break under the weight of their circumstances. But it didn't. In fact, it only seemed to solidify, the connection between them growing deeper with every passing second. "I don't know what I would have done without you tonight," Alexander said, his voice low, almost a whisper. Jasmine turned to face him fully, her expression earnest. "You didn't have to do anything, Alexander. I wasn't looking for rescue. I came because I wanted to be here with you, for you. This is just as much about me showing you who I am as it is about you showing me who you really are." The words hung in the air, soft and honest. Alexander took a deep breath, looking into Jasmine's eyes with something akin to wonder. For so long, he had been surrounded by people who wanted something from him, family, friends, business associates, but Jasmine was different. She wasn't here for his wealth, his name, or his position. She was here for him not as a billionaire, but as a person. And that realization hit him hard. He had spent so much of his life building walls around his emotions, around his relationships, all in the name of preserving the image of who he was supposed to be. But Jasmine had torn those walls down with nothing more than her presence. She had challenged him, not to become something else, but to be more of who he truly was. "I don't want to hide anymore," Alexander said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "Not with you, not with anyone." Jasmine's eyes softened and she stepped a little closer, her fingers brushing against his. "Then don't," she said simply, her voice steady but filled with the kind of strength only someone like her could possess. "You don't need to hide with me, Alexander. Not anymore. The world's too big for that." The weight of her words settled around them like a quiet promise. Alexander exhaled sharply, realizing that this was the first time in his life he truly felt free. Free from the expectations of his family. Free from the judgments of the people who only saw him as a symbol of wealth and power. With Jasmine, he could be more than that. He could be the man he had always wanted to be. A man who was defined by his actions, his heart, and the people he loved, not by the empire he had inherited. "I want to be with you, Jasmine," Alexander said, his voice low, sincere. "I want to be in a world where we're both free to just be." Jasmine's gaze softened even more, and a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "I'm glad to hear that," she said quietly, "because that's the only world I want too." For a long moment they stood together in the quiet of the terrace, the city lights flickering like stars in the distance. The world around them felt distant, unimportant. Nothing could touch them in this moment. It was as if everything had fallen into place. Their relationship, once fraught with complexities and external pressures, now seemed simpler. They didn't need to try to fit into anyone's mold. They simply had to exist as they were. As Jasmine leaned in to kiss him, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't realized she had been searching for. The kiss was gentle, but it carried with it everything they had fought for throughout the evening. The understanding, the bond, the unspoken promise of what was to come. But just as their lips parted, a voice echoed from the doorway behind them. "Alexander, Jasmine." Both of them turned to see Olivia, standing just inside the open door, her posture stiff but her eyes less guarded than they had been all evening. There was something in her gaze now, a softness, perhaps a flicker of acknowledgement that she hadn't fully grasped earlier. I just wanted to say," Olivia began, her voice tentative but clear, "that I'm sorry for everything. For how I treated you, Jasmine. You're right. I've spent my life thinking I had to be something, someone. But you made me realize that I don't have to be that anymore." Jasmine regarded her carefully, her expression unreadable at first. Then slowly she nodded. "It's okay, Olivia. Change takes time, but you don't have to do it alone." Olivia seemed taken aback by Jasmine's kindness, her eyes briefly flickering with emotion before she took a step closer. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'm not sure where to go from here, but I'm willing to try." The three of them stood together for a brief moment, the weight of the evening finally lifting. The air felt clearer now, and for the first time it seemed like they were all on the same page, not just in this family, but in life. Jasmine had not only changed the dynamics of the night, but she had created an opportunity for something new to begin. A new way of thinking, of being, of living. And for Alexander and Olivia, that change was inevitable. The future was now full of possibilities. The night wrapped up in a quiet blur, the buzz of the party dying down as the last guests trickled out of the ballroom. Jasmine felt the weight of the evening settle into her bones, but it was a different kind of weight now, one that was rooted in accomplishment, not tension. The ordeal with Olivia had been challenging, but it had also been necessary. It had cleared the air, broken down walls, and given them a chance at something real, something genuine. Standing in the dimly lit entryway of the wedding venue, Jasmine felt a strange sense of finality. It wasn't that the evening had ended, it was that something fundamental had shifted, not just within her or Alexander, but within their entire world. The Grant family had always been a fortress, unyielding and unbending, but tonight it had cracked. The foundations had been shaken, and while Olivia's apology had been tentative, it had been the first step in the long process of rethinking everything they had believed about themselves, about what mattered and what needed to change. Alexander, standing beside her, had been quieter than usual, his mind clearly still processing the events of the night. He hadn't said much after the confrontation with Olivia, but Jasmine could feel the weight of his thoughts, the quiet pride in his silence. It was as if he were realizing something he had never allowed himself to acknowledge before. The weight of his family's expectations had always been there, but now it felt like something he could shed. And for the first time, Jasmine saw the potential for him to walk beside her, not just in the confines of a carefully curated world, but in one where he was free to be his truest self. "Are you okay?" Jasmine asked, her voice low as she turned to him. Alexander smiled, the expression more relaxed than it had been all evening. "I think I'm starting to be," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "I never realized how much I was carrying until tonight." She nodded, understanding the weight of his words. Jasmine had always known the burden of expectations, the pressure to be something she was. It was the reason she had built her empire in the first place, to create something of her own, something that was beyond anyone's control or judgment. But Alexander, though he had built an empire too, had always carried the weight of being part of something larger. He had never truly been allowed to step outside the shadow of his family's legacy. But tonight it felt different. Tonight it was as though he had stepped into his own light for the first time. "I've been running from my own truth for so long," Alexander continued, his voice quiet. "But now I see that the only way forward is to embrace who I really am, not the man my family expects me to be, not the heir to the throne, but just me. And with you, Jasmine, I feel like I can finally do that." Her heart swelled at his words, but she kept her gaze steady. "You don't have to do it alone, Alexander. You've never had to." He looked at her, a deep, almost vulnerable look in his eyes. "You've taught me that." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Jasmine had always been the one to push against the tide, to carve out a place for herself in a world that had never quite accepted her. But now, for the first time, it felt like Alexander was stepping into that same truth, one that she had always known but had never fully been able to share with him until now. "We're not perfect," Jasmine said, her tone steady but warm, "but we're real, and that's all that matters." He nodded, taking a step closer, his hand finding hers. "You're right, we don't need to be perfect, we just need to be ourselves." There was a quiet moment between them, where the world seemed to fall away. Outside, the cool night air wrapped around them like a protective cloak, and for the first time, Jasmine felt like she wasn't just surviving this life, she was living it. She had built something that mattered, something that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. And now she was sharing it with someone who saw her, truly saw her, for who she was, not just the successful businesswoman, but the woman who had fought for every inch of her place in this world. "I'm glad you're with me," she said softly, the words simple but heavy with emotion. I've never been so sure of anything. Alexander squeezed her hand, his gaze unwavering. Me neither. Just as they turned toward the door, ready to leave the venue behind, Olivia appeared from the shadows, her expression softer than it had been all night. She had been watching from a distance, giving them space to process, but now she stepped forward, her gaze meeting Jasmine's with something akin to respect. I just wanted to say, thank you, Olivia said, her voice quieter than before, almost apologetic, for everything, for showing me that it's okay to not be perfect. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand everything you've been through, but I'm going to try, I promise. Jasmine met her gaze, the earlier tension now replaced with something more genuine. You don't have to understand it all, Olivia. You just have to live your truth. For the first time, Olivia smiled, a real smile, unburdened by the weight of expectations. I think I can do that, she said. With that, the final walls between them seemed to crumble. Olivia wasn't just apologizing anymore. She was taking the first steps toward her own transformation. It wouldn't happen overnight, but it had to start somewhere, and Jasmine had given her that starting point. As the three of them stepped outside into the cool night, the sound of distant city traffic humming in the background, there was a sense of something new being born. This wasn't the end of the evening. It was the beginning of something much larger. For Jasmine and Alexander, their journey was just beginning. For Olivia, the road ahead would be filled with new choices, choices that would define her path forward. And for all of them, the old world they had known, one built on expectations, power, and appearances, was fading away, replaced by the promise of something more real, more authentic. As the trio made their way toward the exit, the cold night air greeted them like a new beginning. The grand wedding venue, once full of noise and extravagance, now seemed distant, fading behind them as they stepped into a world that felt lighter, less constrained by the heavy expectations of the past. For Jasmine, the night had been a revelation, not just of her strength, but of how far she had come. What had started as a moment of discomfort, surrounded by those who didn't understand her, had transformed into a quiet victory. She had spoken her truth, and in doing so, she had opened the door for others to do the same. Olivia had seen the cracks in her own carefully built world, and Alexander, the man who had been her anchor, had begun to see that he didn't need to carry the weight of everyone else's dreams on his shoulders anymore. He could create his own path, and Jasmine would be there with him, walking beside him, just as she always had. For Olivia, the road ahead was uncertain. She wasn't sure what changes she would have to make or how she would balance the expectations of her family with the need for personal freedom, but for the first time, she didn't feel alone in that struggle. She had seen the courage in Jasmine's words, and though it was hard to swallow, it was the push she needed to stop pretending, to be honest with herself. The road to change wasn't easy, but Olivia was starting to understand that it was the only road worth taking. As they stood by the car, the engine humming to life beneath them, Alexander glanced at Jasmine. The bond between them had deepened in ways neither of them had anticipated. They weren't just a couple anymore. They were partners, standing shoulder to shoulder in a world that was still trying to catch up to them. He could feel the weight of everything he had inherited, the family legacy, the expectations, the judgments, but it didn't seem so heavy now. He smiled, turning to Jasmine. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with sincerity, "for showing me who I can be, for making me see that I don't have to be the man I've been told to be. I can be myself, with you." Jasmine's eyes softened as she reached for his hand. "We're not perfect, Alexander, but that's the beauty of it. We don't have to be anything but what we are." With that, the car pulled away, leaving the wedding venue behind, but also leaving behind the walls that had once kept them confined. The city lights stretched out before them, reflecting in the windows as if the road ahead was wide open, full of possibilities. Months later, Jasmine and Alexander stood in the heart of their new venture, a tech startup that combined Jasmine's expertise in cybersecurity with Alexander's business acumen. It was a space where both of them could thrive, where their strengths complemented each other without the weight of old expectations. Olivia, too, had found her own path. She had decided to pursue her own business interests, no longer confined by the role her family had set out for her. The tension had not disappeared overnight, but with time, it had eased into a quieter understanding, and the three of them found new ways to define their relationships without the old boundaries. The road ahead would still be filled with challenges, but it was their road to walk, side by side. As Jasmine and Alexander looked out over the skyline one final time, they realized that this moment, this life they were building together, was something they had both fought for and created. They didn't need anyone's approval to live it, and that, in itself, was the greatest victory. The future, as they saw it now, was theirs to write, and for the first time it felt right, it felt real. And so, with every step they took, they moved further into their future, one of truth, love, and the freedom to be exactly who they were meant to be. The end.